Claire Bennett never imagined that the most important decision of her husband's life would be made while her blood was soaking through a hospital sheet. The fluorescent lights above the operating room blurred together as another wave of pain stole her breath. Someone tightened the blood pressure cuff around her arm. Someone else called for another unit of blood. Through the haze, she heard the obstetrician speaking with urgent precision. "We can't wait any longer. We need emergency surgery." A nurse pressed a phone into Claire's trembling hand. "Try your husband one more time." Thousands of miles away, Adrian Bennett stood at the head of a polished conference table overlooking London's financial district. The room was filled with investors, attorneys, and board members who had spent months negotiating the acquisition that could secure his place as the next CEO of Bennett Healthcare Holdings. His phone vibrated once. "Claire." He pushed back his chair. Before he could take a step, another voice filled the room. "If you walk out that door," Victor Bennett said, without raising his tone, "you're no longer my successor." Silence settled over the boardroom. The phone continued to ring. Back in the operating room, another contraction bent Claire forward. She could barely keep the phone in her shaking hand before the call disconnected. The doctor looked at her with quiet sympathy. "We need consent now." Claire stared at the blank signature line. For a heartbeat, she imagined Adrian bursting through the doors, apologizing for being late, taking her hand the way he had promised he always would. The doors never opened. She lowered the pen onto the paper and wrote her own name. At almost the exact same moment, on the other side of the world, Adrian uncapped his fountain pen and signed the final page of a contract worth billions. 2 signatures. One secured a corporate empire, the other tried to save a mother long enough to meet her children. Neither of them yet understood which document would shape the rest of their lives. Would one decision destroy a family that had taken years to build? Could success ever be worth the moment it demanded in return? And if the chance to choose came again, would either of them make the same choice? Claire Bennett hated prenatal appointments, not because of the needles, not because of the waiting, but because every time she walked into the clinic alone, she had to pretend it didn't matter. She settled carefully into a chair outside the examination room, one hand resting over her 36-week belly. Around her, anxious fathers carried diaper bags, held coffee cups, and argued playfully over baby names. The ordinary warmth in the room made her smile. Then her phone vibrated. "Adrian. Running into another board meeting. I'll make it up to you tonight. Promise." Claire read the message twice. She typed, "The twins have been kicking all morning. I think they're waiting for you." Her thumb hovered above send. Instead, she deleted the sentence. "Good luck today." That was all she sent. Claire Bennett. The ultrasound room was dim, except for the soft glow of the monitor. "There they are," the technician said with a grin. "Both very active today." 2 tiny heartbeats filled the room, fast, strong, alive. Claire laughed when one tiny foot pressed against the screen while the other baby shifted away. "They already have their father's energy." The technician printed 2 ultrasound pictures. "You'll want to show this to your husband." "I will," Claire meant it. As she stepped into the hallway, she lifted her phone and opened Adrian's chat again. Before she could send the picture, another notification appeared. "Executive session, phone silenced." She stared at the screen for several seconds, then locked the phone. The pictures disappeared into her purse. Across downtown Boston, Adrian Bennett was already 15 minutes late for the executive strategy meeting. His father didn't acknowledge him when he entered the boardroom. Victor Bennett simply continued speaking. "Atlas Harbor isn't just another acquisition. It's the project that decides who leads this company after me." The room fell silent. Adrian took his seat. Only then did Victor look at him. Family distractions handled. A few executives exchanged uncomfortable glances. Adrian answered evenly. "Claire had a prenatal appointment." "And yet you're here." Victor nodded once. "Good. Leadership is measured by the meetings you refuse to miss." The words landed harder than Adrian expected. He glanced at the phone beside his notebook. One unread message. "Claire." He almost picked it up. Victor's voice interrupted again. "Eyes on the future, Adrian." Without thinking, Adrian turned the phone face down. That evening, Claire had dinner waiting before the front door opened. Adrian looked exhausted. "I'm sorry." The meeting ran long. It always does lately. He kissed her forehead before she could answer. "I'll be there next week." Claire smiled gently. "You've said that before." "I know, this time I mean it." She wanted to believe him because she still saw the man who used to leave work early just to surprise her with cheap takeout and watch old movies on the couch. That man hadn't disappeared. He was simply buried beneath promotions, deadlines, and one promise after another. As Adrian reached for his coffee, he took a sip and smiled. Perfect, just the way I like it. Claire looked down at her own untouched mug. She had added sugar to hers. For a moment, she couldn't remember whether she actually liked sweet coffee, or whether she'd simply forgotten her own taste after years of remembering his. Outside, Adrian's phone buzzed again. Victor. Adrian answered on the second ring. Claire watched him walk toward the study and quietly close the door behind him. She couldn't hear the conversation. She only noticed that when he came back 20 minutes later, his dinner was cold. And somehow, so was the evening. By the end of the week, Adrian was in London for the final Atlas Harbour negotiations. He had promised to return before the twins arrived. Claire had reminded him that babies rarely respected corporate schedules. The first pain felt almost ordinary. Claire Bennett stopped halfway through folding a tiny white onesie and rested a hand against the kitchen counter. A tightness spread across her abdomen. She closed her eyes. "It's too early," she whispered. The twins had been due in almost 3 weeks. Another pain came before the first had completely faded, sharper, longer. Her phone was already in her hand. Adrian. It rang. No answer. A second contraction bent her forward. Claire's mother, Margaret, rushed in from the laundry room, her face draining of color. "Claire?" Claire forced herself to breathe. "I think we need the hospital." The emergency department moved faster than Claire could think. A wheelchair, bright lights, voices overlapping. Someone wrapped an identification band around her wrist while another nurse checked the twins' heartbeats. The doctor studied the monitor for only a few seconds before looking back at her. "We're dealing with significant bleeding. We need to prepare for an emergency C-section." Claire felt the room tilt. "Today? I'm afraid we don't have another option." Across the Atlantic in London, Adrian had barely noticed his phone vibrating. Victor was presenting the final strategy for Atlas Harbour. Every executive around the table knew what today meant. If the acquisition closed, Adrian would become the board's official choice to succeed his father. Victor looked directly at him. "This is the biggest day of your career." Another vibration. Adrian glanced down. Claire calling. His heart skipped. He reached for the phone. Victor continued speaking without missing a beat. "The investors from Singapore have already landed. No mistakes." Back in the hospital, another contraction tore through Claire. She grabbed the bed rail until her knuckles turned white. The obstetrician returned carrying a clipboard. "One baby's heart rate is beginning to fluctuate. We're losing time." A nurse leaned closer. "Mrs. Bennett, is your husband on his way?" Claire wanted to answer yes. Instead, "I'm still trying to reach him." The nurse nodded gently, hiding her concern. Adrian stepped quietly toward the conference room door while everyone studied the presentation. His thumb had already unlocked his phone. A wall of missed notifications. Claire, Margaret, the hospital. Before he could call back. "Adrian," Victor's voice stopped him. Every head in the room turned. "Where are you going?" "My wife is at the hospital." Victor didn't react. "Sit down. The deal starts in 5 minutes." "It's an emergency." Victor walked toward him. For a moment, his voice almost sounded sympathetic. "You've spent 12 years building this opportunity. Doctors know how to deliver babies. But only one person can close this acquisition." Silence spread through the room. No one looked up. No one dared interrupt. Victor lowered his voice. "If you walk out now, the board will wonder whether you're ready to lead thousands of employees. And so will I." Claire's breathing became uneven. The pain no longer came in waves. It stayed. The doctor looked at the latest scan and immediately turned toward the surgical team. "Prep the operating room, now." A nurse handed Claire her phone one last time. "Please try him again." Claire pressed Adrian's name. Ring, 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 voicemail. She didn't leave a message. She simply stared at the screen until it went dark. For the first time that day, she stopped believing he would answer. Adrian looked at the conference room door, then at the phone in his hand, then at his father. Victor said nothing else. He didn't need to. The entire room was waiting. Adrian slowly lowered the phone. His fingers tightened around it before placing it face down on the polished table. Without another word, He pulled his chair back in and sat down. Thousands of miles away, the operating room doors swung open for Claire Bennett. The consent papers were already waiting. The consent form was already on the stainless steel tray when Claire Bennett was wheeled into the operating suite. The bright lights overhead hurt her eyes. Machines beeped in the quick, uneven rhythms. A nurse tucked a loose strand of hair behind Claire's ear before speaking as gently as she could. "Mrs. Bennett, we still need your husband's authorization." Claire looked toward the operating room doors. She knew Adrian wasn't there. She looked anyway. The obstetrician glanced at the monitor. "We're running out of time. If we wait any longer, we could lose you, or one of the babies." The words settled over the room with terrifying calm. A pen was placed in Claire's trembling hand. Thousands of miles away, a leather-bound contract was opened in front of Adrian Bennett. The conference room had gone silent. Every signature page was marked with a yellow tab. Victor pushed the folder a few inches forward. "Congratulations. Everything you've worked for is right here." Adrian didn't move. His phone vibrated again against the polished table. "Hospital." His thumb brushed across the screen. For one brief second, he almost answered. Victor spoke without raising his voice. "The investors are waiting, so is the board." Adrian slowly closed his eyes. Back in Boston, Claire could barely keep the pen steady. She wasn't thinking about the surgery anymore. She wasn't even thinking about the pain. She was thinking about a promise. "I'll be there next week. This time, I mean it." The memory hurt more than the contractions. The doctor knelt beside her. "Claire, we need your decision." She looked once more toward the empty doorway, then lowered her eyes to the paper. With shaking fingers, she signed, "Claire Bennett." The ink was smudged where a tear landed before she could wipe it away. At almost the exact same moment, Adrian uncapped his fountain pen. His signature flowed smoothly across the final page. Adrian Bennett. The applause came instantly. Executives stood, hands were shaken. Someone opened a bottle of champagne. Victor rested a hand on his son's shoulder. "I knew you wouldn't disappoint me." Adrian forced a smile. It lasted barely a second because beneath the applause, his phone was still vibrating. "Scalpel!" The operating room came alive. Nurses moved with practiced precision. The anesthesiologist leaned over Claire. "I'm going to need you to stay with us." Claire nodded weakly. Everything below her chest disappeared into numbness, but fear didn't. It only became quieter. Somewhere behind the surgical drapes, voices rose. "Suction! More pressure! We're losing blood." The heart monitor quickened. Claire tried to speak, but no sound came out. Then, the first baby's cry pierced the room. A second cry followed only moments later. The surgeon smiled behind his mask. "They're both breathing." Claire's lips trembled. She never got to see them. Darkness slowly closed around the edges of her vision. The celebration in London was interrupted by one ringtone. "Julian." Adrian answered immediately. "Julian." His assistant didn't speak for several seconds. When he finally did, his voice was unsteady. "Sir, Mrs. Bennett made it through surgery." Adrian released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "And the babies?" "They're alive." Relief flooded his chest. Then Julian continued. "There were complications." A pause. They almost lost her. The noise inside the conference hall suddenly disappeared. The laughter, the congratulations, the clinking glasses. All of it faded behind those 4 words. Adrian slowly looked down at the contract he had just signed. Only minutes ago, it had felt like the greatest achievement of his life. Now it was just paper. He closed the folder without another word. For the first time all day, he wanted only one thing: to go home. He didn't know that the woman waiting there would never again be the Claire who had believed every promise began with, "I'll make it up to you." The first thing Claire Bennett noticed when she opened her eyes was silence. Not complete silence, just the strange kind that exists after a storm has already passed. The monitors beeped steadily. Sunlight slipped through a narrow gap in the curtains. For one long moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then the pain arrived. A deep ache spread across her abdomen, stealing her breath before memory returned. The surgery, the babies, the operating room. She instinctively turned toward the bassinet beside her bed. It was empty. A nurse noticed her movement and walked over with a reassuring smile. "They're doing well. They're in the neonatal unit for observation." Claire let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "And my husband?" The nurse hesitated. He hasn't arrived yet. She didn't ask another question. Later that afternoon, the twins were brought into her room together. Wrapped tightly in white blankets, they looked impossibly small. Claire reached out with trembling hands. One baby wrapped tiny fingers around hers, while the other stirred against the nurse's chest. "Hi," Claire whispered through her tears. "I'm your mom." The quieter twin yawned and settled almost immediately. The other began to cry, her tiny face tightening with each breath. Claire gathered her carefully against her chest. Within seconds, the crying softened. The nurse smiled. "I think she already knows where home is." Claire closed her eyes. This was the moment she had almost missed forever. The door opened quietly. Adrian stepped inside carrying a bouquet of white lilies. He looked exhausted. His tie was crooked. Dark circles framed his eyes. For a second, Claire saw the man she'd fallen in love with. He crossed the room slowly. "I'm sorry." No explanation, just those two words. Claire looked at him, really looked. She noticed he was still wearing the same suit from London. The conference badge remained clipped inside his jacket pocket. He had come straight from the airport. But he hadn't come in time. Adrian carefully placed the flowers on the table. "I should have been here." "Yes." Her answer was calm, too calm. He looked relieved that she wasn't shouting. "I couldn't leave. My father." Claire gently interrupted. "You don't have to explain. I already know you made a choice." Silence settled between them. One of the babies stirred softly. Adrian instinctively stepped toward the crib, then stopped, almost as though he wasn't sure he still belonged there. "I kept thinking," he said quietly, "that once the deal was finished, everything would finally slow down." Claire gave a faint smile. "You've been saying that since before we got married." Adrian lowered his head. He had no answer because she was right. There had always been one more project, one more promotion, one more sacrifice that was supposed to fix everything afterward. Claire reached for the hospital bracelet around her wrist. She slowly slid it off. The plastic snapped with barely any sound. "I need something from you." Adrian looked up immediately. "Anything." She met his eyes for the first time since he'd entered the room. "I need time." Nothing more. No accusations, no tears, no threats. Just 4 quiet words. Adrian frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means..." Claire looked toward their sleeping children. "I don't know how to be your wife today." The words landed harder than any scream could have. Adrian took a slow step forward. "Claire." She gently shook her head. "Please, not today." He stood there for several seconds, then nodded. "I'll come back tomorrow." Claire didn't answer because she no longer wanted another promise. She wanted something promises had never been able to give her: presence. When Adrian finally walked out of the room, he paused outside the closed door. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about the board, or the acquisition, or his father. He was thinking about the silence inside that room. It frightened him more than any argument ever could. Inside, Claire watched the evening light stretch slowly across the floor. One of the babies began to fuss again. She lifted her daughter gently into her arms. The tiny heartbeat against her chest was steady, certain, unlike everything else in her life. Claire kissed the baby's forehead, then quietly made a decision. She wouldn't make it today, she wouldn't even speak it aloud. But when she was strong enough to walk out of this hospital, she wouldn't be walking back into life the way she had left it. 3 days later, Claire Bennett signed her discharge papers. The nurse looked up in surprise. "Your recovery is going well, but are you sure you're ready?" Claire smiled politely. "I don't think staying here any longer will heal the part that hurts." The nurse didn't ask another question. Outside the hospital, Claire's mother waited beside a silver SUV. Margaret hadn't said, "I told you so." She hadn't criticized Adrian. She simply opened the passenger door. "Come home," Claire nodded. For the first time in years, home wasn't the townhouse she shared with her husband. The twins slept almost the entire drive. Claire watched them through the rearview mirror. Every few minutes she reached back just to touch a tiny blanket or adjust a little hat. Nothing else seemed important. Not the unopened messages on her phone, not the missed calls, not the flowers still arriving at the hospital from Adrian's office. Only the quiet breathing behind her. Adrian walked into an empty house just before sunset. The lights were off. The kitchen was spotless. On the dining table sat 2 unopened baby books Claire had ordered months earlier. He smiled faintly. She must still be at the hospital. His phone buzzed. It was Margaret. Claire left the hospital this morning, Adrian frowned. She didn't tell me. She and the twins are staying with me. Relief washed over him. That's okay. She just needs a little space. Margaret remained silent. Adrian, this isn't about space. Before he could ask what she meant, the line went dead. That evening, Adrian drove to Margaret's house carrying groceries, fresh flowers, and 2 stuffed teddy bears. He stood on the porch longer than necessary before ringing the bell. Claire opened the door. She looked tired, but different. Not colder, not angrier, simply farther away. You didn't have to bring all this. I wanted to. She stepped aside. Come in. One twin was asleep in a portable bassinet. The other was awake, blinking slowly at the ceiling. Adrian knelt beside her. Hey there. A tiny hand wrapped around his finger. His face softened. I missed you. Claire watched quietly from across the room. For a brief moment, this almost felt like the family she'd imagined. Then Adrian's phone vibrated. He glanced down instinctively. Victor Bennett. He rejected the call. It rang again and again. Claire noticed. So, she asked softly, did the board celebrate? Adrian sighed. It isn't about celebrating. Dad wants me back tomorrow. You don't have to go. I know, but there are things only I can handle. The sentence escaped before he realized it. Claire lowered her eyes. There it was again, not a lie, not cruelty. Just another reason, another meeting, another obligation that somehow always arrived first. I'll only be gone for a few hours. Adrian spoke quickly, as though solving a problem. After that, I'll spend the whole weekend here. Claire looked at him for several seconds, then smiled. It was kind, almost gentle. You don't have to keep making promises. The words confused him. I'm trying. I know, and that's what scares me. He frowned. I don't understand. Claire glanced toward the sleeping babies. I don't think you'll ever choose us on purpose. I think you'll just keep choosing work, one reasonable decision at a time. The room fell silent because neither of them could honestly say she was wrong. When Adrian finally left, he kissed each baby before walking to the door. I'll see you Saturday, Claire nodded politely. Drive safely. No, I love you. No, we'll be waiting. Just kindness. The distance between them hadn't arrived all at once. It had been growing for years. Now, both of them could finally see it. Driving back downtown, Adrian loosened his tie and let out a long breath. She wasn't asking for a divorce. She wasn't screaming she hadn't thrown him out. She simply needed time. Time healed people, didn't it? He convinced himself that once the pressure at work eased, once he proved he could balance both worlds, Claire would come home. He still believed love could survive on future intentions. He didn't realize something had already changed. Claire was no longer waiting for the next promise. She was quietly learning how to build a life that didn't depend on one. Back at Margaret's house, Claire turned off the lamp beside the bassinets. Adrian's promise to return Saturday remained unanswered on her phone. She placed it face down and pulled the blanket higher over the twins. For the first time, she wasn't measuring the days until her husband came back. She was measuring what life felt like when she stopped waiting. A week passed, then another. Claire Bennett never asked Adrian to stay away. She simply stopped asking when he would come. Some evenings he arrived before the babies fell asleep. Other nights he only stood quietly beside their cribs, kissed each tiny forehead, and left before dawn. He was trying. Claire could see that. Somehow, that made everything harder. One rainy evening, Adrian found Claire sitting on Margaret's back porch with a sleeping baby against her shoulder. Neither of them spoke for a while. Rain tapped softly against the wooden railing. Finally, Adrian broke the silence. I turned down 3 business trips this month. Claire smiled faintly. I'm glad. I thought you'd be happier. I am, but that's not what we're fixing. He looked at her confused. I don't know what else to do. Claire didn't answer because the truth was, she didn't know either. The answer arrived somewhere Adrian never expected. Julian knocked on his office door carrying an old archive box. I found something while cleaning the storage room. Adrian barely looked up. If it's another financial report, leave it. It isn't. Julian placed a faded blue folder on the desk. Mrs. Bennett's medical records. Adrian frowned. Why would they be here? They were delivered to the house while you were overseas. You never opened them. Silence. Adrian slowly untied the worn string around the folder. The first page wasn't a medical report. It was a visitor log. Emergency contact notified. Adrian Bennett. Response, no answer. Below it, another line. Second attempt, no answer. A third, a fourth. By the bottom of the page, the unanswered calls filled nearly every line. His fingers stopped moving. That's impossible. His voice was barely audible. I never saw them. Julian hesitated. There are more. He handed Adrian another document. A nursing supervisor's incident report. Patient's husband unavailable. Consent delayed. Patient signed for herself due to medical emergency. Adrian read the sentence again, then again. His breathing became uneven. Claire signed, alone? Julian lowered his eyes. Yes, sir. Adrian left the office without saying a word. Instead of driving to Margaret's house, he drove to the hospital. The head obstetrician still remembered him, not because he had been there, but because he hadn't. The doctor opened Claire's file and quietly slid one page across the desk. This is the consent form. Adrian looked down. Claire's signature wandered across the line in shaky, broken strokes. The ink blurred near the end. She was bleeding heavily. We couldn't wait any longer. The doctor paused. I remember asking if her husband was coming. What did she say? The doctor's expression softened. She said, he'll come if he can. Adrian closed his eyes. Even then, Claire had protected him. He drove straight to corporate headquarters. Victor was alone in the executive dining room. He didn't look surprised to see his son. You've been distracted lately. Adrian placed the consent form on the table. Claire had been admitted to the hospital. Victor's expression remained unchanged. I saw the alert. Adrian's voice hardened. And you never told me. Victor calmly poured himself a cup of coffee. It said she had gone into labor early. I assumed the doctors would handle it. You watched my phone ring. Victor remained silent. You knew something was wrong, and you treated it like an inconvenience. Adrian slammed both hands onto the table. You made sure I understood what leaving would cost, but never asked what staying might cost me. I told you what I knew. You reduced my wife's emergency to an early delivery. Victor leaned back. Because that was the information I had. I didn't stop you from leaving. I simply reminded you what walking away would cost. The room became unbearably quiet. Adrian wanted to argue, to blame someone, anyone. Instead, he remembered his own hand lowering the phone, pulling the chair back, choosing to sit down. Victor's voice broke the silence one last time. I didn't make the decision. You did. The words struck harder than any accusation, because they were true. That night, Adrian parked outside Margaret's house. The lights were still on. Through the living room window, he saw Claire sitting on the floor between the twins. She was laughing as one baby grabbed her finger, while the other refused to let go of a stuffed rabbit. It was an ordinary moment, small, quiet. Everything he'd claimed he was working so hard to protect. Yet he was standing outside it, alone. He rested his forehead against the steering wheel. For the first time, he stopped asking why Claire had grown so distant. Instead, he asked himself a different question. When had success quietly become more important than being there? He didn't know the answer, but he knew where it had to begin. With the two signatures that neither he nor Claire would ever forget. The invitation arrived on a Monday morning, Atlas Harbor Medical Campus. Grand opening and CEO Leadership Award. Claire Bennett read the card once before placing it back on the kitchen table. Margaret frowned. You're not actually thinking about going. Claire folded the invitation neatly. I'm not going for the ceremony. Then why? She looked toward the twins playing on the living room rug. Because something has to end. The ballroom glittered with polished marble and crystal chandeliers. Executives, investors, politicians. Everyone had come to celebrate Adrian Bennett, the man who had transformed Bennett Healthcare into one of the country's fastest-growing hospital networks. Claire stood quietly near the back of the room. No dramatic entrance, no reporters, no lawyers, only a plain cream-colored envelope resting inside her handbag. On stage, Victor welcomed the audience with practiced confidence. Leadership demands sacrifice. The room applauded. It demands difficult choices. More applause. Victor smiled toward Adrian. And no one has demonstrated that better than my son. The applause grew louder. Claire lowered her eyes. She had heard those words before. Only now, they sounded different. Please welcome our new Chief Executive Officer. The spotlight followed Adrian as he stepped onto the stage. He accepted the award. The applause seemed endless. He searched the audience instinctively, then he froze. Claire was standing halfway down the aisle. Their eyes met. For the first time in weeks, neither of them looked away. Adrian walked to the podium. The speech on the teleprompter waited in front of him. He didn't read a single word. Instead, he looked at Claire. Victor noticed immediately. His expression hardened. Adrian. It was barely a whisper. Only his son could hear it. Stay on script. Claire slowly walked toward the stage. Security moved instinctively. Adrian raised one hand. It's okay. The ballroom fell silent. Claire climbed the 3 steps without hurrying. She stopped beside the podium. From her bag, she removed a single folded document, nothing else. No photographs, no medical records, only one sheet of paper. She placed it gently on the podium between them. Adrian looked down. His face lost all color. The emergency surgery consent form. His wife's signature, shaking, uneven, alone. Claire's voice was calm. So many people are celebrating today. She looked around the room before turning back to Adrian. But I only want to ask one question. No one moved, no one spoke. She rested one finger on the signature line. Do you remember this day? Adrian couldn't answer. Victor stepped toward the microphone. This isn't the place. Claire looked at him politely. I'm not asking you. She turned back to Adrian. I'm asking my husband. Silence. The cameras kept recording. Not one person applauded. Claire took a slow breath. If today could happen again, if your phone rang, if you knew I was waiting, would you come? Victor's voice cut sharply through the silence. Don't answer that. The company. Adrian slowly lifted his hand. His father stopped speaking. For the first time in his life, Adrian interrupted him. Yes. The word echoed across the ballroom. He looked at Claire, then at the paper, then at the hundreds of people watching. His eyes filled. I would leave that room, even if I lost everything. His voice cracked. Because that day, I already did. I thought I was protecting our future. I thought there would always be another chance to make it up to you. A tear slipped down his cheek. I was wrong. He looked out across the audience. No one forced me to stay. My father gave me a choice. The board gave me pressure, but... He drew a long, trembling breath. I chose. I signed a contract. While my wife signed a consent form, because I wasn't there. Complete silence. No one looked at Victor anymore. They were all looking at Adrian. He slowly removed the CEO medal from around his neck. The ribbon slipped through his fingers onto the podium. I accepted this award believing it represented success. He shook his head. It represents the worst decision of my life. Victor stepped forward again. Enough. Adrian didn't even turn around. No, this ends today. He faced the audience. If leadership requires me to become the kind of man who misses the moment his own family needs him most, then I was chasing the wrong definition of leadership. He placed the medal beside Claire's consent form. One symbol beside another, one gained, one lost. Only now did he understand which carried more weight. Claire quietly picked up the consent form. She didn't smile, she didn't cry, she simply nodded once. Not because everything had been repaired, it hadn't. Some wounds never disappeared. But for the first time since the operating room, Adrian had stopped hiding behind explanations. He had finally spoken the truth. Claire turned and walked toward the exit. This time, Adrian didn't ask her to stay. He knew some journeys couldn't be shortened with promises. They could only be honored with actions. Behind him, the ballroom remained perfectly still. The applause that had filled the room only minutes earlier never returned. The resignation letter was only 1 page long. Adrian Bennett signed it before sunrise. No negotiation, no conditions, no request for another title. When he placed it on Victor Bennett's desk, the old man didn't look up immediately. You'll regret this. Adrian stood quietly. I already regret the decision that mattered. Victor finally met his son's eyes. You built this company. Adrian shook his head. No, I helped build the business, but I nearly destroyed my family. Without another word, he turned and walked out. Victor didn't call him back. For the first time in decades, the chairman was left alone in the office he had always believed mattered more than home. By the following autumn, the renovated brick building on the corner had a new sign. Family Birth Companion Foundation. Claire Bennett smiled as she welcomed a young couple through the front door. The husband looked terrified. "My wife says I'm asking too many questions." Claire laughed softly. "Trust me, there's no such thing." Inside, the foundation offered childbirth classes, counseling for working families, and support for parents who face difficult pregnancies alone. Every room carried the same quiet message. No one should have to choose between success and showing up for the people they love. Near the back of the building, Adrian stacked chairs after a parenting workshop. No tailored suit, no executive assistant, no reserved parking space. Just rolled-up sleeves and tired hands. A nervous father approached him. "My boss scheduled an important meeting on my wife's due date. What would you do?" Adrian didn't answer immediately. He looked through the glass wall where Claire was helping another expectant mother. Then he smiled sadly. "I'd go to my wife." The young man laughed. "Just like that?" Adrian nodded. "Just like that. Because some meetings can be rescheduled. Some moments never come back." That afternoon, children filled the playground behind the foundation. The twins ran toward the swings, laughing as the autumn wind chased fallen leaves across the grass. Claire watched from a nearby bench. Adrian walked over carrying 2 juice boxes. Without saying anything, he handed her one. "Thank you." "You're welcome." The conversation ended there. It wasn't awkward, it was peaceful. They watched the twins race toward the slide. One stumbled. Before Claire could stand, Adrian was already there, lifting their daughter back onto her feet. She brushed the dirt from her knees and laughed as though nothing had happened. Claire couldn't help smiling. "Higher?" Adrian asked. The little girl nodded enthusiastically. He pushed the swing gently, not too high, not too fast, just enough. Claire remembered the question she had asked him on that stage a year earlier. "Would you come?" She didn't need to ask anymore. Today, he had. When it was time to leave, the twins ran between them, each reaching for a different hand. Without thinking, Claire took one small hand. Adrian took the other. The 4 of them crossed the parking lot together beneath the fading afternoon sun. No promises were made, no declarations of forever. Some stories didn't end with everything being restored. Some ended with people choosing differently than they once had. Claire looked ahead. Adrian glanced at her for a moment. She returned a small, quiet smile. It wasn't a promise that the past had disappeared. It was simply an acknowledgement of the present. There were still things they had not repaired and questions neither of them was ready to answer. But Adrian was no longer asking Claire to trust the man he promised to become. He was showing her who he had chosen to be today. The twins laughed as they pulled them toward the car. This time, neither parent let go.